Ah.
Oh, there's 10, 11, 12, 13.
Here they come.
So they are there. Thank God. At least when you have a real event, you know, don't have this technology stress.
But you know, the pointer is usually not working, or there's always something not working.
Yeah, but I don't know. It's 59, 60.
You always have technology stress in a talk. Just different technology stress.
The more you do it, the better you get.
We had in my hometown when I was a teenager, we used to organize jazz concerts, and we had one concert where
Can you see that?
The maintenance guy sort of walked onto the stage and says, 10 o'clock at night, I think it's time to wrap it up. I need to go home. So,
I can see that. Yeah. So, yes. We're live, by the way. We're live. So we'll wait, just for all the participants, we'll wait a few minutes.
Should we drop onto mute in the short term?
You can obviously talk between yourselves if you so desire. I
think everyone's hearing everything we're saying. Let's get some water.
Maybe a few guys.
Okay, we're live. Good evening. Good evening, Selina.
You're live. Thank you, Selina.
Good evening.
We're going to wait a few minutes just while everyone settles in and gets their port or soup before we get started.
Yeah. Anthony, is that getting recorded? The whole webinar? Is it being recorded now?
It's being recorded.
Okay.
So just for anyone who would like to know, the event is being recorded and will be made available via YouTube in due course. So before we get started, just a reminder to everyone to use the chat bar and make comments. And there is also a Q&A function that you can use. So just be aware of that. So we've got 120 participants so far, I think. So 270 registered. So we'll just wait a little longer. We've already got our first question. Is this a question from Alex? Thank you, Alex. So just so everyone knows, over about 275 people have registered for this event, which is just fantastic. So this is our second event. And you'll notice in the chat bar, I'll just return that. While people are getting ready, I'll repeat myself later, but I've just put a link in the chat bar, which allows you to look at a map of Indigenous Australia. So we're hoping that everyone who joins in can actually type into the chat bar where they are located in relation to Indigenous Australia. So you can click on that link, and if you're not certain as to what your Indigenous region is, you can check that map. So we'll just wait another 5 or so minutes before we get started. If I send to all panelists, I can just say, you know, they can turn their video off if they choose.
Oh, okay. Oh, yeah, good point. Yeah.
disable videos from the start?
I've already sent them a note to say to disable, for them to disable their video, for the panelists to disable. And what's fantastic about this webinar is it's all over Australia. We've had people register from Brisbane, from Sydney, also all over the place. So it's fantastic.
I saw someone from London.
London.
And we also have participants, attendees from Canada, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, or Canada, as a former Prime Minister would have said. Yes, given time difference, that's quite incredible.
I think one of the benefits of this whole COVID-19 has been that these meetups have been virtual, which means we can reach a lot more people. So we're up to 172 participants, so we'll just wait a little longer for everyone to get into the room. So talk amongst yourself, I guess, if you can.
Okay, we all set. Anthony, are we? Yeah.
You think so?
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Only 170. All right, well, let's kick things off. So first and foremost, welcome everyone to the third webinar, which is looking at Passivhaus. And we've got three fantastic speakers. Caroline, who's going to talk about Architects to Clare, and Claire and Simon, who are going to talk about Passivhaus. Stefan will introduce the speakers, and I'll simply be here answering questions and doing whatever. But first and foremost, I'd like to acknowledge country. So I'll start with that we acknowledge the traditional owners of the country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I think I'd also like to acknowledge all the people who are working to bring about peaceful resolution to conflicts at the moment. There's a lot going on, as we are all aware. And I'd also like to acknowledge all the people that are working to create a better environment and a better future for the planet. So with that, I will hand over to Steph, who will introduce our first speaker, Caroline Pidcock, who'll take us through where Architects to Clare is at the moment.
Okay, yeah, good evening, everyone. Great turnout, so thanks everyone for attending. As Anthony said, it'll be a really good lineup tonight and a really interesting topic. Just a few housekeeping things first. This event is BYO, so make sure you got dinner, snacks, or something to drink between you and your computer. We can't see or hear you, so if you got dogs, children, or television running in the background, that's fine, as long as you don't get distracted. And then obviously use the chat box on the side if you have any questions, and we try and answer them after the presentations as best as we can. So I'd like to introduce Caroline Pidcock as first sort of presenter. Caroline is a Sydney-based architect and owner of Pidcock Architecture and Sustainability. I've known her got to know her in the process of setting up the Architects to Clare movement, and she's been incredibly passionate and committed to setting it up, getting engaged, and getting other people engaged. So it's very hard to introduce her achievements and her commitment and her activity over the last 28 years. So I just picked a few, and I tried to pick the ones that are easy to say with a German accent. So a few of her involvements or achievements are: she's a life fellow of the Australian Institute of Architects. She was a board member of Renew, the South Australian Forest Industry Board, Greening Australia, New South Wales, and the New South Wales Architects Registration Board. She was a board member and chair of the Living Future Institute of Australia, president of ASPEC, and president of the Australian Institute of Architects. She's currently the chair of 1 Million Women, a global movement of women to empower them to act on climate change through the way they live. She was awarded the Australian Institute of Architects New South Wales President's Prize, recognized by the International Living Future Institute as a living building hero. She's the spokesperson of Architects to Clare, and yeah, she will give you a brief update of where the movement is at, and I look forward to Caroline's presentation.
Thank you very much, Stefan and Anthony, and thanks for hosting and organising this. It's really fantastic. And it is, and welcome to everyone. I'm just seeing the amazing locations and people, and it's fantastic. So on that note, I'll start sharing. Okay, so I'm going to give you a pretty quick update of where we're at with Australian Architects Declare and how all of this passive house fits within what we're doing. So I too would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to their elders past, present and future. I can't, this is just possibly one of the most important things that we need to do, and I think the events of the last week or so have shown that without acknowledgement, without justice, we can't do what we do, and it's really important that we do. So yeah, just I can't emphasize that enough. Just as in my way of acknowledging this, I think that we all need to understand how the land on which we live and have been born and grown up is really important in shaping us. I was born in Grafton in the northern part of New South Wales on the banks of the mighty Clarence River. The traditional custodians of that area are the Bundjalung, the Gumbayar and the Yagal nations. At 3, I came to Sydney, where I continue to live, and I've been just privileged to grow up around the beautiful waters of Port Jackson in the bushland and beaches of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It seems with everything that's happened that Greta Thunberg's clarion call that we have a problem, you know, just last year when she's, you know, when people started, the students started climate striking, it seems like a long time ago, but her message actually is even more important now than it was. You know, we have a problem that's bigger than COVID and we need to act on it. Since she started talking, you know, we've had one of the worst droughts ever in Australia. We've had rivers where fish die. We've got another bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef. And then we had the summer of 2019, 2010, where we really understood what our house is on fire. And, you know, here we are, boy. After that, we had dust storms, we had hailstorms. Then we had floods, and we had floods even in the bushfire areas, as if they hadn't experienced enough. Then along came COVID and a whole lockdown and a whole new way. And stunningly, we all took the science on board and acted quickly and found that change actually can happen rapidly and in huge amounts. It's very interesting. And still it wasn't the end. Then we've just had this whole episode of yet another black man being killed. And it's not just in the States, it's here in Australia. And there's so much to deal with. But, you know, there is, as Audre Lorde says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle, because we don't live single issue lives. And all of the things that we're currently experiencing are connected. And we just, you know, we need to kind of do something. And I think that Vanessa Nakate sort of said, you know, we can't go back to what used to be. We need to really radically change. We need to do things differently. And we need to address all of these things together, which is kind of perfect. And I think with being totally disrupted, it's kind of the perfect time to do it. So what can architects do? What should architects do? Well, first of all, I think, you know, congratulate every single one of you who have joined up to Architects Declare. And as of today, there are 906 signatures, which represents way more than 906 people, because collectively we can do an awful lot. I think our movement is about being spontaneous, decentralized, and non-hierarchical and disruptive. And what a time to be disruptive. You know, it's about every single one of us taking responsibility for action in our own lives and practices. We're not waiting to be told. We need to grasp this moment and do what we can, and together create a community-led change making, because that's where the strength is. Our vision is to empower architects to create a paradigm shift in our behaviour and take responsibility for action in our own lives and practices in a way that the creation of buildings and cities will no longer be the problem, but be a catalyst towards the regeneration of the planet, so that we can live in a constantly regenerating and self-sustaining world where we collaboratively work towards the health of people and ecosystems. It's a big vision and it's an exciting one that I hope we all get on board. So what are we doing? Well, right now we're in the process of creating our own ecosystem where many parts with different attributes make the whole work well. That's a network of diverse people and groups to support and help each other achieve great things. There's a whole bunch of declare movements. There's the architects, engineers, there's councils, planners, construction, and I think together we can all help each other achieve what we've signed up for, but also support each other in making bigger asks. We're also working with existing organisations really closely who have been playing in this space, and let's all work together. We're working with government agencies and with universities. We've set up a number of different task groups on regenerative design, sustainability action plan templates, technical targets and tools, website, advocacy, research. All of these will be, we're sort of going to be issuing a, asking people if they're interested in helping us with these different task groups in the very near future. There's lots of work to be done, but it's kind of exciting to be working with people caring about this. The mission, which is on the website, there's a number of different points. I'm just tonight with looking at Passivhaus, I'm just looking at a couple of ones, particularly the ones about regenerative design, because I think that's actually one of the key things that architects can contribute to, and then whole life carbon modelling. So you know what architects are good at? We're very good at understanding complex systems, how they connect and intersect, and how we can creatively realise the potential in the systems for the benefit of all. We're so uniquely placed to do this, and right now that is what's needed, and it's such a exciting opportunity for us to step into. You know, the whole regenerative design happens at all different scales, at all different sizes, and it's, you know, I think what we've got to do is focus our attention on how we can create so much better things at all of those levels and connect them all. The other side of it that's sort of probably a very tangible one is carbon. And, you know, on the left is the UN sort of a thing that came out of the UN late last year, which shows where the business as usual trajectory is going, where we need to be, and the huge gap. The Economist, which is, you know, pretty, it's not a left-wing magazine, also sets out very clearly what the business as usual, what the gap between the business as usual and the 1.5 degree warming scenario is. We've got so much work to do. I think, you know, and here's another one from the Climate Action Tracker, which kind of shows again. So this is not a tweaking of what we do. This is not a put it off till next year or the year after. This is like serious stuff, but it's not that we can't do it. We can. It's just that what we've got to do is really focus our attention on different things, on how do we create fantastic buildings that we love living in that also addresses this. You know, building operations this is a global CO2 emissions by sector. Building operations at about 28%, building materials, that's embodied energy at 11%. So architects are playing in the space of about 39% of global CO2 emissions, and there's so much scope to do so much better. In the UK, they've kind of really named the targets that look at operational energy, embodied energy, potable water use. They've split them into domestic buildings and non-domestic buildings, which are basically the two main types of buildings that will be built over the next 10 years, and looking at the targets that need to be hit in those spaces. I think in Australia, we've looked at operational energy, and tonight we're going to look at how to reduce that significantly. Embodied carbon is a whole big area that we all need to really address. And water use, I think Australians are fairly leading in that because we're a country of drought and little water. But this is kind of what that looks like. It's a serious dive down. So we've really got to look at how we can achieve these really big targets really quickly. The LETI is the London Energy Transformative Initiative. Have done a whole lot of work. We're talking with them, and I'm working actively with a whole bunch of people, from Engineers to Clare and Architects to Clare and Institute of Architects and ASBEC and BZE and others, that we might try and translate this. LETI have said they'd give us all their information, and we'll try and do something to work for Australia. So within all of that, thank you, Passivhaus, because here's a fantastic way of really creating really healthy buildings that have absolutely really minimal energy consumption. And that's kind of where we need to be at the very least. And then we need to also look at embodied energy as well. And that is within the framework of really regenerative design. So the Declare movement is actually an invitation to be part of co-creating the regenerative future we need. So if you're not already signed up, it would be great for you to get involved and be part of it. Take responsibility for achieving this with us and help us do it, because together it'll be a really exciting and interesting journey. And it's a journey we just absolutely have to take. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Caroline. If attendees would like to give her a round of applause by the chat bar, please do. There is that option. So, and we'll ask questions of you, Caroline, at the end. But I'll hand over to Steph to introduce our next speaker.
Yeah. Thank you again, Caroline. And I trust everyone that it gave you a brief insight on where Architects Declare are at. And it did remind me of a discussion I had with my son on the weekend, who came back from the rally, and we talked about contributions to a cause. Obviously, the outcome of an argument is everybody walks away thinking they won the argument. I think I won by saying that following a rally are a number of very laborious but very important small steps. And obviously Passivhaus, which we want to talk about today, is a very important concept that sort of ultimately has the potential to, to change the way we design, deliver, and occupy our buildings. And so therefore it will make a very important contribution to tackling climate change. So in that context, I'd like to introduce Clare Parry, who is a sustainability consultant, and we'll talk about Passivhaus principles. She has, as she told me, she had a very long passion for engineering, which, as I understand, started with her irreversibly dismantling her mom's typewriter. Claire didn't tell me how old you were, but I assume that obviously there were a lot of learnings out of this, and besides learning about the mechanics of the typewriter, you could have also worked out how to deal with apprehension, critical feedback, and how to focus on a long-term goal and not be derailed by small setbacks. So obviously she learned from that experience and pursued a mechanical engineering and business degree at Swinburne University. And her career eventually led her towards Passivhaus and the Living Building Challenge. She has some very relevant views that she will touch on today in her presentation on what constitutes best practice. So for her, it all starts with central principles of health, well-being, comfort, and economy, the 4 pillars of Passivhaus. She is a director of Grun Consulting, who provides ESD consultancy for buildings, and is the founder and director, a founding director and chair of the Australian Passivhaus Association, which she established in 2012. In her own words, in the most of Melbourne, in the most of Melbourne ways over coffee. Over to you, Claire. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen, which I think is this one. I think I was about 8 when I took apart the typewriter, and the worst bit was when I put it back together, there was a spare piece, which you never want. So thank you very, very much for hosting particularly myself tonight, to talk about Passivhaus. We are signatories, so my firm is an engineering firm, but we're signatories to Engineers Declare. And just before COVID hit, we hosted our first event on how do we move from, you know, saying that we want to do something to actually doing something. And we were very fortunate to have a lot of partners in that event, but we are very, very ready. So, sorry, it doesn't want to move. There we go. So I founded Grun about 5 years ago. One of the, I guess, best and worst things I ever did while I was on maternity leave. Hot tip, never do that. About 3 years ago, we joined the Inhabit Group, which is a much larger firm of specialists in, I guess, building design, facade design, and all other, it's quite a multidisciplinary company these days. So we are very, very interested in creating a better built environment. What that means is that we design with evidence. In particular, our team designs with proven solutions based in physics. We have quite a large, relatively large building physics team. We rigorously test all our innovations, and we're very happy to do what hasn't been done before, but we do rely on science and physics and all other sorts of evidence bases to ensure that it can and will work. We're engineers and scientists by training, but we're also very passionate about the earth. So every single time there's an opportunity to be outdoors, you can rest assured that every single member of our team is out there. And I'm always impressed hearing about what they get up to when they come back. So as I mentioned, and as Caroline mentioned, happily, we are signatories to Engineers Declare, and that's, I would very much advise tapping into that network as well. So as Architects Declare signatories, join forces with the Engineers Declare signatories. We are all there trying to make a big difference. So, and one thing I know that we often get presented with a lot of charts and graphs and bad news, but we do need to celebrate the small wins. So climate change is what we would call a wicked problem. That means it's volatile, it's uncertain, it's ambiguous, it's complex. There's no simple solution. So fixing something with, you know, there is no simple fix, there is no single solution, there's no single fix, and often solutions lead to more problems. There's flow-on effects. So it's potentially unsolvable, but we can reduce its impact. So small wins, celebrate them, they're important. So our journey, we know that when we signed up to Engineers Declare, our journey would be a long one. We're right at the start of it. One thing that we've also realised, well, I think we knew, it's not straightforward. We will go off in certain tangents, we'll go off in different directions, we'll try all sorts of things, but we really, really, really are dedicated to getting there. We've come up with a strategy. It involves our people, it involves what we say, it involves what we do, it involves how we do it, but most importantly, it involves how we interact and realise our projects, which is, I guess, the number 4 on that list. We've made the commitment, we're coming up with the strategy. We've got 18 offices around the world working together. We're Inhabit's actually now part of a much bigger group, so the collaboration is quite extreme these days. We took Architects Declare's lead, particularly that of, I guess, some of the early signatories. Earlier this year, we dedicated 2020 to be the year that we would go carbon neutral, and we're really excited about that. Of course, COVID came along and put a massive dent in that. We're exploring how we still achieve that. How do we, for example, manage the carbon emissions of our staff as they're no longer in the office? It's not a matter of signing up to green power now, it's a matter of signing up to offset potentially or contribute to green power for our 400 employees as they're out and about in the world in their homes. But tonight I have to focus. I have to just talk to you about Passivhaus. There's a lot that I have to say about Passivhaus, but there's a lot I can't say tonight. But if you do have any questions, please do get in touch with us. One thing I will say is that you can't unknow Passivhaus, and this has been my experience. I came across it about 12 years ago, and you know, I now run a Passivhaus consultancy. That says everything. So once you know, you can't go back. And the reason you'll continuously hear about it from anybody who knows about it is because they love it. So most converts I know change the way they work. So I hope that that's true for some people here. The other thing that I will highlight is that you'll start seeing thermal bridges absolutely everywhere you go. Window frames, structure, anything you see. Thermal bridges everywhere. My recent foray into it has been with my own home, which is this. So the other thing about passive house is, how do you know someone lives in one? Is that they will tell you. And I tell everyone, because particularly at the moment, particularly as we're all at home, starting to realise, I happily moved into my passive house home in October, and the timing couldn't have been better. So right up front, I'm going to say passive house isn't everything. Passive house does a few things extremely well, but it does need to be a part of a bigger holistic picture. It does efficiency, health and comfort. It doesn't do embodied energy. It doesn't do water. It doesn't consider transport. It's part of a picture. So my home, we like to joke that we did this renovation because we outgrew the bath. Really what we did, so we had a really old house, 110-year-old double brick. The big problem with real estate is that you often don't get to choose what you buy, particularly in major cities. You take what you get. So every building you buy often has a lot of problems. This was very true of my own home. So we knocked off the back half and rebuilt it. We've very quickly learned, particularly in the last few days, that, or the last few weeks rather, that the old bit is extremely cold. So it's about 12 degrees inside most of the time. Luckily, I'm working in a passive house. So part of the bigger picture with this particular project, and I'm a big advocate for rating tools like the Living Building Challenge. We took our inspiration. I actually did want to rate it to the certify it to the Living Building Challenge. It was just a bridge too far on this project, but highly recommended, Living Building Challenge. So red list free, focus on materials, absolutely. Dematerialization, so it's timber lined, there's no plasterboard, for example. Triple glazing, double stud walls. So the thermal performance aspect of it was just a part of it. Renewable energy, no car parking, for what it's worth on a single family home, and rainwater as well. But one of the things I'm really proud of on this is the life cycle carbon emissions. So focusing on that drastic reduction in emissions over the lifetime of this building. You'll notice there, so the little red sliver is the embodied carbon emissions from the construction. And it's really the operational emissions that we absolutely slashed. But I'll cover that in a bit more detail as we go forward. So one thing that I guess we're all quite familiar with is the concept that it's really hard to convey big ideas in a concise way. But I think that's what Passive House does extremely well. It's 5 things. So, the takeaway from this presentation, I hope, is that if you do a few things really well, you can still get a great building. I'll go through these in a lot more detail shortly. One quote from a Passive House guru, Elron Burrell, if you do reading on Passive House, you'll probably come across him, is that Passive House is simple, but definitely not easy. And another quote from him is that Passive House is a team sport. So pull in your expertise, work together. These are the 4 outcomes, I guess. And I think these were sort of in my introduction there. So what we really do focus on with Passive House is comfort. It's comfort. So it's a comfort standard. It delivers a healthy building. There's a focus on occupants. There's having buildings that are warm in winter and cool in summer. It should be designed in. As a default, they're healthy. Energy efficiency is a side effect, and return on investment comes, from doing all those things well. And the Passive House standard, its major strength is that it's adapted for place. So every design has its own context and climate. If you come across Passive House buildings in different climates, don't think that they can be applied or should be applied to your climate zone. There's a massive misconception that there's one way to deliver a Passive House, but yeah, don't believe it. When we think about carbon as well, carbon is, it just taps into efficiency. There's so much more to this standard than that. And then if you break those down, health and well-being is the huge focus. Don't try and sell Passive House on energy efficiency, cost saving. It rarely works unless you're doing it, you know, for an institutional client who is focused on that. But the investment really is in other things. And there is a lot of detail on these slides, so I'm going to allow them to be shared after. So don't stress if you're missing stuff as I go. One of the neatest ways I think I've ever seen Passive House summarised is this. So back before we had technology, buildings were pretty simple. We could consider them pretty dumb boxes. We added heating in winter and that was about it. As technology advanced, buildings kind of didn't. So we started to just overlay tech fixes to problems that we've actually realised shouldn't have existed in the first place. So this 21st century solution, this new idea is that buildings should do most of the things, you know, that most of the functions that a building performs should be done without tech solutions. And then there are a few straightforward systems that can provide, for example, ventilation and the supplementary heating and cooling that we just end up with, which is much, much smaller, drastically smaller. So this is Elrond Burrell, he may even be on the call. Hello, if you are. If the best way I've ever seen Passive House described is, you know, think of it as a Porsche. Maybe compare Porsche to a Ford Focus, for example. They're both cars, but the experience of driving one is absolutely different to the other. It does the job, but it's not the same thing. So one thing I would recommend, and one thing I would probably say about Passive House is you probably aren't going to comprehend it exactly until you've been in one. So if you can get to a site, absolutely do it. There is nothing I can describe to you that you will comprehend until you've been in one. So you need to go in one, feel it, hear it, dwell in it. Where I'm really happy that this analogy falls apart is that Passive House actually doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to have the cost differential of, you know, the Porsche versus the Ford Focus. So the beauty of it is that it can sometimes be cheaper. So it does depend on your baseline, of course. And the other thing is that I would actually say don't compare, you know, Passive House should also be all electric. So this holistic solution, the whole potential for carbon reduction. At its absolute core, Passive House is about isolating what's happening inside from what's happening outside. And the idea of fabric first. And that can apply equally in cold as to hot weather. So there are Passive Houses all around the world. It doesn't mean it's a hermetically sealed box. Openable windows are mandatory in actual fact. Most people believe that the building is sealed up. You go in and that's it. But you know, you can have indoor, outdoor living. There's not really much of a compromise, and every design can almost be a Passive House. Without going into this in too much detail, Passive House is a comfort standard. These are all the metrics. It's quite a technical standard. It was created by physicists. As a result, I would actually almost say that it lacks a bit of marketability as a result. So, you know, German physicists aren't known for their sales ability. But all of those metrics, which basically equal comfort, can be delivered under an energy standard. And this is actually, these are the numbers. This is what, if a Passive House meets these numbers, it's a Passive House. But, you know, leave these numbers to the, I guess, to the Passive House designers. Don't get caught up in needing to know about the physics. I'll help you understand what those 5 rules are just now. So number 1, high level of continuous insulation. The idea is that it's not interrupted essentially, and that might sound extremely simple. It's not achieved well in practice. So for example, the code, it's getting better, but it led us to believe that, you know, an R2.8 wall was an R2.8 bat in a stud wall or whatever it might have been. In reality, once you involve that stud in the construction, it breaks it down so that it basically interrupts insulation. It reduces that thermal performance slightly. So what might have been ideally an R2.8 wall might actually be R2, which can be accounted for and should be accounted for and is tolerable in some sense. What isn't exactly tolerable is when you put high conductivity materials into those walls. So there are versions of construction that don't work so well in passive house. I'd say a great way to overcome this is to separate the structural and thermal lines. That's an easy win. But you know, a passive house designer can help you overcome sort of all these issues. Number 2 is airtight construction. It doesn't mean the building is airtight. The windows should open. This means the envelope is airtight. And what that essentially is saying is that air should be controlled. It's not airtight building, as I mentioned. So airtightness has started to come into the code. So you can now comply with, you know, it was always there, but it was descriptive. It wasn't enforceable. You could sort of say, yeah, I tried, but you know, how hard did you try? You can now use blower door testing to comply with the code, but it is an optional element. It has a massive impact on performance. What we are trying to say is that air doesn't go through, you know, the envelope layers. That undermines thermal performance entirely, but it also doesn't come into the building through uncontrolled gaps and leaks. And also don't think of airtightness as, you know, this plastic rain poncho. Think of it as Gore-Tex. The building still needs to have vapor permeability, ideally, which is also creeping into the code as well. This isn't technically something that passive house demands, but it is absolutely good practice. Number 3 is minimise thermal bridges, which are much more prevalent than we consider, especially in Australia. Often we have, you know, expert architects from pretty much anywhere else in the world come over and say, I can't believe the way you build. I think it's something most people just aren't as aware of as we need to be. This, again, has come into the 2019 NCC. You see a lot of these pretty pictures in passive house, in the passive house world. These are thermal heat flux images, essentially showing temperature. So in this one, blue is cold, red is warm, so 20 degrees on the inside. And thermal bridges are just where heat flows from inside to outside. How this impacts us is really vapor damage. So humidity is prevalent in air. All air has moisture in it to a varying degree. Where we have thermal bridges, what plays out is either visible or interstitial, so in the construction, moisture damage and, you know, rot, deterioration. They're bigger issues than we give them credit for. Often they're invisible, we can't see them, they're behind layers of plasterboard, cladding, whatever it might be. But the energy loss is also quite extreme. Think of some building designs as radiators. In some climates, this is less of a problem than others, but you'd be surprised at the sort of impacts this can have. So a great example is this building, the Aqua Tower in Chicago. Somebody took it upon themselves to take a thermal image of this building. It's essentially a radiator. There are ways to overcome this. High performance glazing. So I'm actually covering a lot of ground here. So a high performance glazing, very, very important. If we consider glass or the windows, the entire window to be part of the thermal envelope, it should ideally perform as close to the wall performance as we possibly can. So the thermal losses through windows and frames are in fact typically the very worst performing element in an entire building for thermal transfer. So we go to all this trouble of insulating a building and then we put poor windows in. It's very much a waste of time. So as I mentioned, part of my house is renovated, part of my house is passive house, part of it's not. So the image on the left is the triple glazing in the passive house element of the home. On a really cold morning, we get condensation on the outside. On the image on the right is the really old single glazing, basically raining inside. I had to open the windows so that the water could all drip off outside instead of inside. This is a function of good design, whether we get condensation on the inside or the outside, or even at all. So this is on glass in particular. So the windows have a massive role to play for comfort, You know, condensation at best is annoying. At worst, it creates mold, health issues, respiratory issues, and it should be, you know, condensation should be designed out, and it's actually practically designed out in a passive house design. Now, the ventilation system. So a passive house doesn't, a ventilation system isn't mandatory, but it's kind of the ribbon that ties the whole concept together, or the cherry on the cake. Once you have an airtight building, you need to consciously ventilate it. And ventilation is just a function of healthy spaces. So this can absolutely be natural ventilation, but then among other things, you get 0% heat recovery. And as well as that, you also, you know, you have to manually intervene every time you need fresh air. So this, you know, you might need fresh air overnight, you might need fresh air when you're out, because you're not just providing air for people, you're also extracting excess moisture, VOCs, all sorts of things. Now, another interesting thing is I changed the filters in my ventilation system the other day. So the filter on the top left there is the new one, and the one on the right is the old one. And I didn't realize it was going to be this dirty. I was shocked myself. So this is the stuff I'm keeping out of my house. So in a passive house building, I'd say about 99% of passive house buildings have this ventilation system. It is actually incredibly simple. It's a core where air streams flow past each other. They cannot mix, but they flow past each other, and heat is recovered. In some systems, humidity is also recovered. And it has 2 fans and a core, and it's an extremely simple system. And one way I'd suggest considering it is, you know, the transition from manually washing clothes to automatically washing clothes. You know, let's consider that perhaps, you know, we don't need to manually ventilate our homes for the most part. So this image is one that you'll probably see every time you do research on passive house. It's from the Passive House Institute, and this is just a summary of those 5 things. It's simple. I hope that's one key takeaway from that. That's passive house at its core. There's obviously a little bit of know-how to it, particularly when it comes to designing actual buildings. I've summarized, I've really oversimplified there, but those are the 5 key principles, and done well across a building of any scale, of any type, of any size, of any construction type, of any usage. You know, there really hasn't been too much limitation. And I've got quite a few examples coming up. What does passive house have to do with net zero? I think it's basically the best, or it's the most optimized way to get there. One of the ways, how passive house, why it is not net zero actually is probably a good thing to explain. So passive house isn't net zero because net zero is in a single building is incredibly expensive to achieve. So net zero on site. The passive house stops at just short, and it stops at that point where, and it was determined for when it was first established, that's where you have a really big step change in the type of heating and cooling system you need to serve a building. So if you minimize or optimize the building envelope, at a certain point you can start to use a different system. You don't need central systems, you don't need large systems. So it's about a 90% reduction in energy use, or HVAC sizing. And in that sense, from there, it's really easy to add renewable systems to serve that very small load. Building, well, you know, on the right, you could basically build a tent, set up a little solar farm next to it, and you've got net zero, but that doesn't mean it's a good option. So passive house is considered one of the really logical ways to get to net zero with optimizing everything. I'm not going to dwell on this too much, except to highlight that, you know, it's the heating system that we are, or it's heating and cooling systems, so active systems that we're minimizing in passive house buildings by optimizing the construction or the building fabric. I actually will skip past this because I don't want to spend too much time on it. How does this fit in with the National Construction Code? So yeah, I've been doing passive house buildings for about 10 years. pre-2019 code, Passive House looked like it was about 50% more or 50% greater insulation levels than the NCC in Melbourne. In Sydney, it's much easier. You could probably say it's 20% more insulation than a code building, but it's about how you put it together. As I mentioned, that whole continuity of insulation, the airtightness. The 2019 code is about, it's stated that it's about 30 to 40% better than 2016. So your baseline is now a lot closer to Passive House. And we've found that with some recent projects that we've examined in detail. Some new bits in the 2019 code, and this is looking dangerously like Passive House, right? We're starting to do condensation risk assessments. Airtightness, so blower door testing is now in there. Thermal bridging is now considered in a much bigger way. So we're starting to see the elements of Passive House come in, and you might sort of be thinking they're pretty fundamental, and I'd agree. So the one thing I would say about the code though is it's still quite elemental. We still consider things in little packages. We don't look at the system, and the code is also reactive. So we had big issues with complying with fire requirements, which in many ways undermined the airtightness membranes we were trying to use for a while. But that change came in 2016, and in 2019 it was refined, so now we can use those membranes again. We had massive issues for a while there getting non-residential buildings to be airtight. How do we figure out if a building is Passive House? I would say if you want to do a Passive House building, engage with somebody. You don't necessarily have to engage somebody, but start a dialogue with somebody who knows about Passive House. What we do when we're doing a Passive House building, we model it in a SketchUp plugin called Design PH. It's a 3D model. It helps us export all this geometry to an Excel spreadsheet. Passive House modeling is done in Excel. I'll say that now. It surprises a lot of people. It considers the site, location, context, surrounds, shading. We also do a lot of thermal bridge modelling. This is Gillies Hall, which we'll see in a lot more detail shortly from Simon. A lot of thermal bridge modelling, particularly in 2D and 3D, capturing a lot of things that aren't considered in other design processes. As I mentioned, Passive House modelling is done in an Excel spreadsheet. The spreadsheet is an absolute beast. It's got about, I believe, 40 worksheets. I should have asked Jim before I put up this screenshot of his project. So this is what it looks like. This is the yes or no page where you say, where you tick all these boxes and you've got a Passive House. But there's a lot going on behind this. The Excel spreadsheet's been validated across the world using ASHRAE 140 among other things, but also using dynamic simulation tests of 17 softwares. So this Excel spreadsheet does exactly what any other software does. It considers climate, all of the envelope performance, all of the solar impacts, including shading, surrounding topography. You also include ventilation systems, heating, air conditioning, hot water appliances, renewable energy. One thing I probably didn't highlight as we were going back through the 5 principles, and even slightly before that, was that there are limitations. So the criteria are that there are limitations on how much heating your building should need, how much cooling it should need, how often it overheats, and the total energy use, which includes all the systems, all the appliances, all the, anything that happens in that building is considered in that limit. For residential buildings, it's not particularly onerous. It's once you get to non-residential buildings, you sort of have to start addressing the types of systems you select. If you add renewable energy, you can then increase the badge that you get. So you can get you can have a Passive House building, which is termed Passive House Classic. If you add some renewable energy, Passive House Plus. If you add more renewable energy, Passive House Premium. Passive House Plus is roughly net zero. Premium is a net energy positive building, or net positive energy. Quality assurance in the Passive House world. I suggest engaging with a Passive House designer if you do want to achieve a Passive House project. None of these are mandatory. You can deliver a Passive House building without touching any of these. Passive house designer has been trained and accredited as has a tradesperson to deliver compliant buildings. Passive house building certifier can come along and give you this badge at the end of the day. So the plaque that goes on your building to say, yes, this is a passive house building. Certified components, not mandatory. You can build a passive house out of anything you want, and most of our projects deliver them using off-the-shelf products. There's nothing special required. The things that are, the market that's catching up fast is windows. Obviously you can't use single glazed aluminium frame windows, the typical ones that we find everywhere. The certified component that I do recommend everybody uses in every project is a ventilation system, because there's just such a massive range of systems out there, some of which are, to put it bluntly, quite rubbish, some of which are amazing. And then there's certified passive houses. So that's the badge that you're looking for at the end of the day. This tiny little plaque, which Simon might share for the Gillies Hall one, but it's quite underwhelming. It's roughly, what would that be? Maybe 4 or 5, or about 20 centimetres by 20 centimetres. It's optional. You can have a passive house. You can say you've got a passive house without getting this badge. It's an excellent form of quality assurance though. If you tie a contractor to it, they tend to pay attention. And that brings up the performance gap. So, which I'll chat about actually a little bit more in a second. Certification process is an audit. A certifier doesn't have to come to site, but they will request evidence of every single piece of your building that had an impact on thermal performance and energy performance. In fact, these are photos of Gillies Hall, for example. I was the passive house certifier for this one, so I took the I went to site quite a few times. I was pretty keen to make sure that I understood this building, that that I got to follow the journey of this building. It's a very amazing one. Looking forward to seeing more about it just shortly. Where does it fit in with all the other rating tools, passive house? So I guess we have 2 categories really. We've got NATAs, so star ratings, and I'll just say right now it's apples and oranges. We have projects that get 9 stars. We have projects that get 7 stars. In performance, they're all amazing, but the rating systems are different. For one, the NATAs tool doesn't consider airtightness. It has airtightness in it, but it's not something you can modify and capture the benefit of. It overemphasizes natural ventilation and thermal mass, which are considered in passive house, but in a much more conservative way. And the other one that it doesn't consider very well is the ventilation system. In fact, doesn't consider at all. So NATAs is basically a passive, assumes passive operation. The other tool I'll highlight now is Green Star. So as I mentioned, passive house is not holistic. It does a few things amazingly well, which are energy and indoor environment quality. And you do get some credits as well for innovation if you do use Green Star. There's a well-defined crosswalk, and you get something between 24 and 30 points in the current version of the tool. Passive house works well with basically every tool out there. I've worked across all of these tools. There hasn't been any conflict at all. It's about tapping in, I guess, in a way that you prioritize the issues that are important for each project. Passive house exemplars. So with this, I wanted to sort of show all of the things that are possible in passive house, and I'm going to go through these quickly and hand over to Simon for the Australian exemplar, which is insanely amazing, very exciting. So social housing retrofits. This has come up particularly in the last few days as we've seen the I'm not sure of the name of the program, but the stimulus program for homes. How about we spend it on improving our social housing quality? So this is a retrofit project in Glasgow. There's plenty of these buildings around Australia that we can do this to. Passive house supermarkets, passive house leisure centres, so huge aquatic centres. There's a few of them around the world now. Passive house high-rise commercial buildings, passive house museums. I'm getting sick of the word passive house myself here. High-rise apartments. The Austrian embassy in Jakarta is a really interesting one. So a really extremely hot and humid climate. A very successful project that's been in operation. It was one that I used to use quite a lot as an example when I was starting out in passive house. So it's been in operation for at least 10 years. another social housing project in Spain, a really huge project about to be built in New York on the left, and another one in Boston on the right. So really, really large projects are coming online now. This one's really great. It's a social housing project that actually won the Sterling Prize in the UK. So, you know, quite a prestigious architecture award going to social housing, which caused a bit of a stir actually. In Australia, I'm not going to touch this one, it's coming up. Bendigo Soldiers Memorial Institute is a high value, it's an RSL gallery, so it holds high value artifacts. It's quite a closely controlled environment for high value artifacts for the RSL in Bendigo. A student residence at the University College in Melbourne. We've got about 100 Passivhaus projects on our books. It's really hard to pick exemplars, but this is a beautiful home in Point Lonsdale in Victoria, a tiny home in Castlemaine in Victoria, a whole bunch of buildings, all of which, bottom left is an apartment building, top middle is a retrofit, a weatherboard retrofit, top right is an education building, centre right is a beautiful one from Talina Edwards, bottom right is a straw bale building. So as I mentioned at the start, build it out of whatever you want, build it however you like. Passivhaus is a very flexible tool. These are all in the works, vet clinics, commercial buildings. Bottom right is pretty exciting. It's a building, it's a house from Fraser's, which is I guess a demonstration project in a typical housing estate. Pretty excited about that one. A lot of CLT projects. That's the end of my presentation. There's a lot there, so thanks for your patience. I will stop sharing because I'm very excited about this case study for Gillies Hall and I don't want to take up too much time.
Well, thank you, Claire. That was fantastic. And I had the privilege of doing a course with Claire on Passivhaus. So as I'm sure you all can all see, really knows Passivhaus back to front. So I'll hand over to Steph, who will introduce Simon. Thank you, Claire, again.
Yeah, also thank you from me, Claire. That was very insightful and it generated a lot of questions. So it'll be an interesting Q&A after the presentations. I won't mention a very long list of illustrious and charismatic German physicists that include Max Planck, Konrad Röntgen, and Albert Einstein. So Simon, our last presenter for tonight, Simon Topliss. He's an associate director of Jackson Clements Burroughs, who are one of the founding signatories of Architects Declare. So Simon, when we spoke earlier, I said I warned you that I looked up your Facebook, that I'm going to look up your Facebook profile. I couldn't find anything, so I went to LinkedIn and I found that you studied architecture at the Victoria University in Wellington, then went to work in London and came back to Melbourne in 2007 and joined Jackson Clements Burroughs in 2010. You're very passionate about mass timber construction and Passivhaus design, and you've been involved in the delivery of the Monash University Gillies Hall, which is a Passivhaus certified student accommodation project. And it obviously ensured that Australia not only has the most beautiful opera house in the Southern Hemisphere, but also the largest Passivhaus certified building in the Southern Hemisphere. You're currently working on another student accommodation project, as I understand, for La Trobe University, and when it's completed, it'll be the largest, Australia's largest mass timber development. So it sounds like there'll be more presentations coming, but I look forward to a Passivhaus presentation and like to see more on Gillies Hall, which is an amazing project. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Stefan, Anthony. That was a great introduction, and Claire for an amazing presentation. It's fantastic to be coming along here to present to Architects Declare, to join this forum and to share our knowledge and our journey that we've taken over the last 3 years. And it's even better to follow Claire, who's explained Passivhaus for me, because it is It's a complex, wonderful tool that we think is incredibly powerful and has a really, really relevant place in the sustainability discussion in Australia moving forward. So I'm here to talk about Gillies Hall. Sorry, I'll just get the screen under control. So Gillies Hall is located at Monash University's Peninsula campus. It is Monash's newest student accommodation building. It's aligned to the university's 2030 net zero carbon targets. It's currently the largest project, as Stefan pointed out, to combine mass timber construction and achieve full passive house certification in Australia. As a student accommodation building, Gillies Hall aligns to the university's strong pastoral care philosophy, providing 150 studio apartments and communal spaces throughout for students to cook, study, sleep, and socialise. But the story of Gillies Hall probably doesn't really start with Gillies Hall. It starts back almost in 2014 to 2016 when we worked with Monash and 3 other firms of architects, Hayball and HRMA and MCR, delivering 4 student accommodation projects on campus. We delivered the Turner building, which is up in the top right. These were 1,000 beds delivered to campus, Logan Hall by McGraw Charles Ryan, Campbell and Holman Halls by Hayball and RMA, and Turner from ourselves. We delivered these with multiplex as well. These were 5-star, Green Star as-built buildings, 1,000 beds delivered in 21 months. These were exemplar sustainable design, I think, as we thought it in 2014 to 2016 when we completed. But these were very much business as usual, and these were precast business as usual, shading compliant glazing business as usual, meeting all Section J requirements, and veggie gardens. And we achieved our 5-star Green Star certification. But what we ended up with was, I think, 4 buildings that as a result, actually didn't perform terribly well. They have high operating expenditure, and the pathway of business as usual, I think, whilst we had all delivered pretty good outcomes architecturally, and it was sort of agreed amongst the community, in terms of sustainability performance and operability and OpEx performance, was something that left a little bit probably to be desired. And I've got nothing against veggie gardens, but it felt that maybe we just somehow missed the mark in some way. So Monash, sort of through the last decade, has really been moving forward with their net zero initiative. And this has sort of been running in parallel: and energy efficiency, campus electrification, renewable energy, offsetting, and a microgrid on campus. So they're a very, very educated client, as you would expect, was one of Australia's leading universities. And on staff at Monash is a wonderful sustainability engineer, Rob Brimblecombe, who's been working away in the background and starting to explore passive house from very early doors. And I know he was sort of talking about it in the background when we were sort of probably since we started working there on campus back in about 2012. And he did an analysis of Briggs and Jacquemus Hall, which actually was built 2 years before Turner, and compared Briggs and Jacquemus, which had natural gas heating, electricity, on-site renewables. So in this diagram, the light blue is the electricity usage of Briggs and Jacquemus, the grey is the natural gas heating. And then he overlaid what a passive house model building would look like if a Briggs and Jacquemus had been built to passive house standard. And what we all sort of knew would come out of this was that the passive house standard would deliver a vastly different building in terms of carbon and energy usage. So there was a kind of groundswell within Monash that Rob managed to get enough people on side to take a brief out to the market in June 2017, which is when we came onto the project, to look at a student accommodation building with 150 rooms with support accommodation. That we were encouraged to attempt passive house certification if we could get it over the line. We were also dangled the carrot of exploring mass timber construction, but all of this had to be done with the proviso of having it open for students in 19 months, which was no tall order, well, which was quite a tall order for anybody who sort of understands normal timeframes of projects. That was a pretty sort of, even if we weren't attempting something innovative in terms of sustainability, that was a fairly ambitious timeframe. So Gillies Hall is a story about going large with passive house in a warm climate. And yes, there's a couple of small examples, but especially obviously in Australia, there was no large scale buildings. And whilst Melbourne is a We sort of found very early on that the Melbourne climate is, there's anybody who's in Melbourne tonight, I know a lot of these people are overseas, Melbourne is a particularly cold climate in winter, so we do have 6 months of really relevant temperatures for the passive house model, but we also have extreme summer temperatures, about over 30, 35, 40 degrees at times in Melbourne. It's also a story of going large with mass timber. And in Australia in 2017, as some of you would know, that looking at mass timber in 2017, we didn't have any local suppliers. So we had to look at potentially looking at overseas suppliers and what that meant, trying to deliver the project in the time frame, and trying to understand whether mass timber and passive house were really well suited to each other. And of course, all of this was from an architectural point of view and from a project delivery point of view, we had to deliver this within 19 months. So concept designs back in July 2017, go out to the market with some sort of schematic design in about September 2017, so that we could get a builder on board early enough to understand the journey that we all wanted to take. Get enough detailing underway by February 2018, so they could look at starting construction in March 2019. So we could hand over for students around February 2019 and have students ready and into the building ready for semester 1 last year. A pretty tall order. And how did we do this? And I think Claire touched on this. We all got on board from day one. And that was client, architect and design team, and then Multiplex the builder when they came on board. And from client, this was having Rob Rimbicum, probably in the background as a sustainability engineer. And then having 2 fantastic project managers from Monash, Ryan Spittle and Richard Felcher, who really were there to support us through the journey and to do whatever they could in terms of procurement to help us with this journey. And then obviously the greater, larger PCG to assist us and endorse sort of where we were trying to take it. And having in the design team that was ready to go from day one and committed to the project. And that was really, really important. So where did we begin? Well, literally on day one, before we had put any pen to paper, we had a meeting with Pablo from AECOM, our ESD engineer from AECOM on the project, and David Ritter from Atelier 10, one of the other local experts in Passive House, and really sat down with them and said, where do we start with this? We have a few books on Passive House. We're ordering a few more on Amazon, and we've got a little bit of knowledge on mass timber, but where do we really begin? And both of them really said, well, you've got to start with first principles. You've got to start with site. You've got to start with basics. You've got to start with the orientation. And you've got to understand your massing. And then once you've sort of got those right, we'll start to talk about the finer details. But for you, please just get it right to begin with. So in a sense, Peninsula Campus was at Frankston was a teaching campus established in the 1950s. It was beautiful by the time Monash had taken over the campus. Now it's a wonderful bush campus in the bush campus tradition, and a really sort of in a beautiful location to be working. Our site was on the western edge of campus, north is to the left of the page on this picture, and our site was actually a car park. So we had an awkwardly shaped site, triangular site, that essentially faced north to south, which was a fairly challenging from the get-go. So we set about to understand this context, and there's a little bit of understanding here from an architectural perspective. And to understand that, to the east we had low-rise private residential dwellings, which compelled our response, even as a building on campus, to be a good neighbour. And we needed to minimise overlooking. To the west of the building at the edge, we had a steep bank dropping down to the social heart of the campus, which was the campus centre building. We needed to understand how the campus was going to develop over the next 15 years as part of the master plan, to understand how our building would key into the existing walks on campus and how the future walks on campus would evolve. We had at the southern portion of our site a very troublesome Melbourne water easement and flooding overlay that restricted how we could plan out that southern portion of the site. And we also, especially which was relevant obviously to Passive House, we had this north-south site. So we had the very real danger of having a lot of east and west facing rooms, which were going to be very difficult to shade and potentially deal with overheating issues. So to develop the massing, we had passive house, especially in the back of our mind to begin with. And so to develop this formal language, we took the typical double loaded corridor plan and laid it north down, south down our site. So when you're doing student accommodation buildings, if you're told to do them economically, you do literally like a hotel, and you run a corridor down the middle, rooms off each end, and you run them as straight as you can. But this didn't seem to work on the site and would have left us with a very, very problematic east and west facing glazing. So we broke these forms apart. We split them forms and rotated them to reduce, and this also helped to reduce the overlooking and improve the solar orientation of our wings. Then we teased these forms apart to create a central gathering space instead of corridors, and importantly introduce light to the centre of our plans in the wings and cross-flow ventilation across the floor plate. And I'll touch on this a little bit later and how this works in Passive House. Centrally, we located the main social and circulation spaces to activate the core. And at ground level, we ran our main common rooms around the campus edge of the building to allow life to spill from inside to out. And then articulated the form by wrapping the upper levels in a screen to protect the rooms from the sun and weather. And this screen was really one of the key tools that we had in protecting the building and starting to deal with our shading. And I'll sort of go and touch on that as we sort of move through the presentation. But what I might do to begin with, before I sort of start to get into the details of how this building sort of came together, was just walk you through the spaces. So the ground floor houses the apartments for the deputy and college head who live on site in the building. Those are in the yellow. The blue spaces are the communal spaces where the students gather to watch movies, cook, eat and gather. There's places to practice piano, there's gaming rooms for AV and study, and there's study areas. This is all on the ground floor. So these spaces locate and are wrapped around by the new landscaping, which is their sort of private communal spaces. And then in the centre of the building is the entry, double-sided with passive house doors on both sides, and then with stairs which run up through the building. The upper levels of the buildings, levels 2 to 6 at Peninsula, is where the students live in 30 apartments per floor. So 5 floors, 150 apartments. The centre of the plan is where students cook and eat and study. And then they're connected by 2 stairs which spring off the centre of the plan. And then each of the floor wings, as we call them, they're 15-bed floor wings. They have studio apartments in these wings that have, each apartment has its own bathroom, it has a small fridge, hot plate, and obviously their bed and study desks. So this is where they sleep and meet. Now, how, from a passive house perspective, what are the basic building blocks of passive house in this plan? And it starts with the heat recovery mechanical ventilation systems. And it's great because Claire's already explained how they work. So each of the rooms in the plans has a heat recovery ventilation system. That's a supply and return to every single room. So every room is provided with fresh air on a constant basis. There is an external shading skin, which is fixed back to the CLT, which is a thermally broken connection. All the facade is fully airtight. Now, on Peninsula, we have at Gillies Hall, we used a CLT, which is our mass timber, which is fully taped facade. So we've got CLT facade panels running around the whole perimeter of the building, and those panels are fully taped to create that airtight envelope. And then we have our doubly glazed thermally broken windows, which are again fully taped back to the CLT facade panels. And then we're using automated cross-flow ventilation where we've split that plan form open to help bring our temperatures down at night during those extreme months. So when the temperatures get high in November, December, January, February, and students are in there, we can then use some automated night purging to start to bring those temperatures back down in the evening if the building does start to heat up. We've also then got the continuous external insulation skin, which is one of the fundamentals of passive house, and a thermally broken skin at that, and that runs around the full perimeter of the building. This is a mass timber building, so how the structure works, and this ties in to sort of especially our envelope, which I'll go into more detail. So we've got a traditional concrete podium, which is our level 1 or ground floor at Gillies Hall. And we built on ground. One of the reasons was to do with the Melbourne water overlay, the flooding overlay which we had on site. And we had sort of large span spaces on ground. So spaces that probably suited more traditional construction and the time constraints of the project just allowed us to have a little bit more time before we needed CLT panels on site. So then the CLT levels, which is the cross-laminated timber levels, is the residential levels 2 to 6. And these run up through the building, repeat, to provide our simple timber box. Now on that diagram, the second diagram along, you can see how these timber panels break up. You've got the internal walls, which are the internal CLT panels, which are the brown panels. The green panels are external load-bearing CLT panels, and then the red panels are external non-load-bearing CLT panels. But the key part of that was what we had was a complete envelope that was CLT. And the quality of CLT panels we were using is inherently airtight. So all we really needed to do was tape the joints in the panels to achieve that passive house envelope. Also, by using CLT on our facade, is we had a CLT timber is inherently a low conductivity material, so we had a very good pathway to achieving that, achieving our thermal, detailing away the thermal bridges on our envelope. So looking at those key passive house elements in section, on the left-hand diagram, we've got that airtight perimeter envelope. So that's the dotted red line runs up from our ground floor spaces, the ground floor, which is the concrete traditional construction, I would say, which has also got I call it a stick-built facade or a stud work facade framing. It was a much more difficult facade detailing to achieve that airtight envelope, but that runs up to the underside of the concrete, runs around, the CLT panels are then taped down to the concrete, it runs up the CLT panels into the window, up and around and on the underside of the CLT panels to the roof. The central diagram here, which is the no thermal bridges to the facade and continuous insulation, which is the red lines. This runs under our slab, up to the sill plates, up the door, up the PH doors on ground floor, around the outside of our building, and around the outside of our structure. And that's obviously really key. And then, as we sort of learned very early on, one of the things that we were really going to be fighting at Gillies Hall was overheating. And so the strategy that we employed at Gillies Hall was to create a sun shading skin to the outside of the building, or the sun shading exoskeleton, and that's shown there in orange. So the passive house in detail, and this is sort of zooming into that in detail, and hopefully you can see this fairly clearly at home. You've got the CLT panels running along, and then what passive house you end up doing is creating a series of, and here is a series of gaskets and joints and sort of to achieve that passive house envelope. So if you can see the two facade panels, the two mass timber panels, there's a little light blue line, that's an acoustic gasket, which helps isolate the two panels acoustically from, so one room from another. And then you've got the passive house tapes. So those panels, the panel joints are taped externally. They're also, in this case, we taped internally as well, which was really a belts and braces approach from Multiplex. They wanted to make doubly sure that we were achieving our that airtight envelope. And then the windows are then carefully located within that wall line, so that so we have timber windows externally, which then have an external aluminium capping. And then there is a thermal break between those, and they're located such that that thermal break is just on the insulation line, and the location of the window within that wall build-up is always quite key in passive house. In between the window frame and the CLT, there's a little dark red dot, and you can see that's a little expandable sponge membrane, and you're then taping both sides. So it's a very, there's a lot of work goes into actually sort of what comes up with a very simple detail. And what was remarkable, we found, was that detail pretty much got us through, that section detail pretty much got us through most of the upper levels of the building. And we ended up with, for this building, you ended up with about 3 A1 sheets to detail the upper levels. The ground floor, which was much more complicated, much more stick built, we ended up with about 10 sheets detailing that. But passive house is, as Claire sort of alluded to, it is about room modelling. So from day one, and these are very early concept plans, clearly not the plan that we ended up with, the slight orientation. We started modelling the room temperatures very early on, and the room modelling. So it wasn't just about making sure we got the whole building working. We wanted to make sure that every single one of the rooms worked. So we had our rooms that were facing south needed to perform just as well as the rooms that were in the top corner facing north. And the great thing about passive house is what's been described with the and especially at Gillies Hall, when you're using the heat recovery ventilation systems, is that the heat that you recover from the north rooms, which are getting a little bit more solar gain, you're able to actually transfer that via the heat recovery system to the south rooms. So you get this wonderful expression, which I really love, is called the socialization of heating in the building. So you're looking at the building holistically. We're looking at ensuring that the southern rooms are performing just as well as the northern rooms. And we were looking at this from very early on. And also from very early on, we started modelling the facade and realising that we had a real journey to go on with the facade, and knowing that without screening, the building was subject to pretty massive heat loads. And one of the strategies that was put forward early on by the ESD consultants, which we thought was pretty solid, was to apply this external screen to the building and start to take these heat loads off that external skin of the building. And this was a very early diagram showing the build-up of the building conceptually, and this was probably at about the end of schematic design. So our CLT mass timber construction in brown on the inside, in white is the insulation, and then a low-cost external skin, which is cement sheet, which is our rain screen facade, and then this external shading skin, which we're calling in this diagram the secondary veil. That facade underwent probably a little bit of value management, and we took out the gantry systems, but the basic concept of the system was there and remained intact through the development of the building. And as we sort of moved through that development, we took this facade. So on the left-hand side, the very sort of basic ideas of the facade, the screen which shades the windows of the building depending on the orientation. Adds in, starts to cue the building in for the orientation, whether it's north, northeast, northwest, or southwest, southeast, and we're changing the depth of those fins, and then using these are metal fins, aluminium, and then adding in folds into the metal framework to start to make the shading, the screen material as efficient as we possibly can, to use as less material as we possibly can to increase the spans. And by doing these little subtle folds, we also started to play these sort of architectural games of shadow and light and colour, and then started to apply a subtle patination over the facade. In Gillies Hall is the sort of images you've seen, and this is the sort of result of it. So windows that are really well shaded, that are tuned to each orientation, that are very carefully played within, and then a surface of the screen starts to play these sort of architectural games of colour and light and shadow and delight, so the concept, I suppose the pH concept, was really starting to inform that architectural language as this sort of the building developed. And I think that's what we sort of found one of the sort of really exciting aspects early on. The key passive house elements, also the heat recovery ventilation systems. So Claire's walked you through how heat recovery ventilation systems work. This is a 3D AXO of actually one of the larger rooms, which was the disabled access, sorry, the accessible SOU. So each room has a supply and return to the room. Those are run up in a stack to the underside of the level 6 roof slab. And then they join together in a spaghetti junction and go up to a single heat recovery ventilation system on each wing of the building. So each wing of the building had one heat recovery ventilation unit on the roof. And so this sort of complex system comes together. And these systems then supply each of the rooms with the required 10 litres a second of air, so that the rooms are constantly getting fresh air. Each of the rooms has windows. Students are free to use them if they'd like to. There's absolutely no restriction, as Claire pointed out, in having windows in a passive house building. And to all intents and purposes, it's perfectly normal. If a student wants to open a window, they're more than liberty to do so. And on summer's evenings, if their room has heated up to above 25 degrees and it's less than 25 degrees outside, it's a no-brainer for students to open their windows and help cool the building. One of the slides that I do like to sort of show is showing business as usual, I think, versus passive house. And business as usual, I'm slightly embarrassed to say, was Turner in 2014. And this is, and if you look around Melbourne or probably a lot of cities in Australia at the moment, this is pretty standard. It's a precast facade panel where the floor slabs are poured into the back of the facade panel, and then you simply slot in a simple double glazed aluminium window into that, and what you've got is a massive thermal bridge, even with your insulation on the inside. You've just got this enormous thermal transfer from inside to outside. We actually went out to tender on Turner with a lightweight facade, but were value managed. Sort of the market determined that the only way that the Turner was feasible at the time was to move similar to the other buildings, which was a precast facade. And on Turner, the agenda was 5-star Green Star, it seemed, and so that was the direction we all headed. And I think we sort of, and probably in terms of performance, probably that's where the building really starts to pay the price. There's just that the really sort of fundamentals and basics of detailing are just really missed. And on the right, we've got the Passivhaus envelope of Gillies. So that's our CLT in brown and sort of the light grey, and then the external insulation of brown and the rain screen. Also, where business as usual versus Passivhaus, anybody will tell you that your ground floor, your level 1 doors are really fun. And they're a real game to play and understanding how you can actually do those. So business as usual on the left, again, this is Turner. So basically the frame just taken straight down to a rebate in the slab. Then you've got your slab that runs out and around and ties into the external paving slab. So once again, wonderful thermal bridge, just dragging the cool temperatures and warm temperatures inside the building. So, and then on the right, Peninsula, Gillies Hall. So that's our internal slab, completely thermally isolated from the external paving slab. The insulation running underneath the slab, up the face of the slab. This was one of the details, it was a very difficult detail to work out. We put an angle in there, we then put a hardwood plate so that we could isolate literally the internal sill plate and the external sill plate. So we didn't have, so there's a little metal plate that the door shuts onto, so that those two plates were thermally isolated from each other. So we didn't have one plate running through, which would have been a pretty clear thermal bridge. And those doors are obviously Passivhaus compliant doors with drop seals to work in this model. One of the more sort of really complicated details, I think, to sort of get over the line. And the other place where we almost come unstuck, amusingly, on Gillies Hall, and this is always embarrassing me, is the fridge. In Australia, when we were looking, the best fridge we could find on the market, performance-wise, was a Hisense 157-litre fridge, 190 kilowatts per year. And this is what we had in the Passivhaus model for quite a few months early on, and we thought we were home and hosed. And then we went and looked at it, and the client went and looked at it, and we realised it was not up to scratch for a student accommodation building, shall we say. In Austria and Europe, where student accommodation buildings are done, a similar type of student accommodation buildings, I witnessed similar to these sort of types of fridges by Liebherr. You had literally half of that from a kilowatt hours point of view, and a really functional fridge, great fridge, not available in Australia. So we were faced with the real prospect of the fridge being the actual element in every room that was going to make us come unstuck. We did manage to find a Haya fridge, which was sort of a 3-quarter fridge, 304 kilowatts per year, actually a very, very good performing fridge in the Australian market, and that got us over the line. But in Gillies Hall, we don't have radiators. They're gone. There's no need for internal heating because our internal heat loads from our fridges, our laptops, and the people in the building are providing the heating for the building. And it was the fridge that actually just about tipped the model for us, took us from a sort of average temperature of around 23 up to 24 degrees. And you need to stay under 25 degrees for 90% of the year for your Passivhaus building to work. So it was the fridge that was really pushing the model and really driving the heat loads, which I think is pretty remarkable. For us, this was about doing different drawings as well, and this is some real IP for anybody out there. Because we were doing mass timber buildings, we were also doing obviously Passivhaus. We were introduced to this whole new world of acoustic gaskets, tapes, strips that go underneath the CLT, tapes that go outside, and we needed to explain in one drawing where all these went. We could do it in the details, but people needed to price it and people needed to order it, and we couldn't figure out what we were going to do. So we ended up doing some really colourful drawings, but it was about sort of understanding a new language because we really didn't have any precedents to look at, and especially at this sort of scale of construction that we were working with. And Multiplex, through our contractor on board, took these drawings on board, and they literally had to go out on a limb because they couldn't get any subcontractors essentially to order these materials for them. They had to go out and actually order all these themselves and supply them and literally hand them to their subcontractors. To actually get this building over the line in the time frame which I talked about, we had to look at a very different design and procurement strategy. So we were appointed in July 2017, schematic design. We did our ECI tender at the end of schematic design. That means early contractor involvement. So from schematic design through design development, we had Multiplex at the table. They weren't contracted at that point on the project. They were there to provide design advice. And essentially they came on the design journey with us. They realised very early on what the project was about, CLT and Passivhaus, and really jumped on board. And so looked at what the procurement issues around CLT was, worked with our project managers. So we needed to start the shop drawings for our, which is the production drawings for the cross-laminated timber, essentially when we were at the end of design development. So working this into the contractual arrangements, we had our project managers in the background. We were documenting our CLT whilst before the contract had been let, and then once we were on site, we were actually finishing our documentation. So this was ECI fast track sort of procurement to make the project happen in these timeframes. Not every Passivhaus project, every mass timber project is going to be done this quickly, but I will say to get these projects over the line, you need to think outside the box as to how you can work, how you can get that contractor at the table early so that everybody can understand what you're doing and really have engaged project managers or people on your side, obviously if you're sort of residential level, to help you on that pathway. So 9 months after appointment, we were on site and starting to cut into the ground and sort of do our excavations. And immediately we started doing things differently. You have the insulation under the slab and with the vapor membrane. Things we were working with an immature market at the time. As Claire alluded to, probably in 2017, we needed 150 windows for the student rooms, and we also had sort of large scale sort of curtain wall type glazing that we needed for the knuckle areas, and then we were really restricted in terms of the Australian market, who we could go to, and we had to look overseas, and these were Germany. These are Doffner windows from Germany. So we had timber windows internally, so it's timber frame internally. There's a thermal break, as you can see, that little sort of gasket, and then an external aluminium cap to deal with weathering. These are really good windows and a wonderful outcome for the project. But it's fair to say probably in the 3 years since our project, the market has really started to mature now, and I think we're starting to see some other products come online. But this was sort of the nature of the beast, I think, in 2017. And working with an immature market meant we needed to order these elements early. And things started to look differently, obviously, pretty early doors once we started putting the mass timber panels up. Panel 1 went up on June 19th, 2018. It was a pretty exciting day for, I think, everybody. I think there was a resounding sort of sigh of relief, and I don't think another panel went up for 3 days. It was just a matter of getting that first panel up for everybody. We also went modular as much as we could allow to get speed of construction up, because obviously we were sort of trying to get this project over the line within 19 months. So we had modular bathrooms, getting those in the sequencing right with regards to the mass timber, and then at the back of those bathrooms, that's where the supply and sort of return air ducts sort of go in. This was also because we were externally wrapping this project in insulation, doing and having this external envelope instead of internally. We were fully scaffolding this building, and I'd say it's probably not typical for buildings probably of the scale to be fully scaffolded because of the time and the cost involved with scaffolding. And scaffolding probably was the major extra overcost on the project with regards to Passivhaus. And I think if we'd had more time, we would have probably been able to get to a point where we could have done a facade system that would have got us away from having to scaffold the building. But Gillies, we were time poor, and scaffolding was the best option we had to get the detailing we needed over the line and make sure that we could get the QA on that facade over the line. We had a timber top deck, which is our CLT panels on the top deck, you can see here, and then 300, those are big 300 sort of joists sitting on that, which then used to pack, that's fully packed with insulation. Again, we took our mass timber up to top deck for speed, and it gave us this this airtight envelope, a really good pathway to that airtight envelope on the roof. But sort of as been alluded to, Passivhaus is all about taping the joints and getting this airtight envelope. So all of our external joints in the building taped, the Rotherblast tapes running around between the wall panels and the slab. There was some overzealous QA certainly going on site. And internally, we didn't not just see the tape sometimes on the facade. We got the occasional subcontractor who taped up the joint between the rooms as well, thinking that that was the right thing to do. But in the end, I think everybody was just trying to make sure that this building was going to pass that that test. So this is that blower door test at the end of the job, and this is our facade joint with our passive house windows on the facade. So in between the window and the CLT panel, you can make out there's a little compression gasket in there. This window is then taped internally and externally with the Rothenbloss tape, and so that provides a airtight, sort of guaranteed airtight envelope. So CLT sort of gave us, I mean, obviously aligned to the low carbon credentials of the project, and something we were pretty excited about. We were excited about it because of its sort of, you know, mass timber construction in Australia is really sort of just starting to get going, and you know, it's sort of got lots of potential. But we discovered it really early on that it aligned really well to sort of help us achieve this passive house envelope both from an airtightness point of view and from a thermal bridging point of view. So the layers of these facade layers. So you've got the CLT, then you've got what you can see then, those galvanized brackets. Those are our facade brackets. They come back into they fix back into the CLT, and I'll touch on those more in a second. On that, you've then got rock wool insulation, the vapor membrane externally. That's all taped up. And then running outside of that is the rain screen, the cement sheet facade, and then outside of that is the shading membrane. And that's how the sort of, I won't go into the fire engineering details of how this facade moved up, but I think probably it's fair to say on this project, it's the first time we've sat down and talked about a facade and had the contractor, the fire engineer, the building surveyor, the structural engineer, the facade engineer, ourselves, pretty much everybody at the table trying to work out the facade details. It was a real sort of exercise in collaboration as we sort of worked through what the ramifications of this facade, and then obviously getting it all over the line with the CFA as well. The thermal bridging and condensation concerns, it was interesting that Claire put a picture of that up in the modelling of these brackets. And these brackets, probably as we sort of went along with these, were one of the things that just about caught us out on site. So the bracket which ties our facade screen back to the main structure was meant to tie into the red dotted line. That was how it was designed by the facade engineers and ourselves. But because this was a design and construct contract, the firm that was actually doing the installation of these facade panels really wanted to connect back into the CLT itself, and so potentially bridging this insulation line. So we needed to do more modelling to see whether these were actually resulting in a thermal bridge to our main, and potentially going to introduce condensation details. Fortunately for Melbourne's climate, we weren't going to suffer from any condensation details, and the minor thermal bridge that we got through that meant that we still wasn't actually going to vastly affect our passive house model overall. I think if you were doing this detail in Europe, we probably would have got into trouble with this sort of detail, but here we were certainly able to get that across the line, and that's probably one of the things we learned as well, that maybe in Melbourne, because of slightly milder winters, some of those issues weren't quite as prevalent in the passive house sort of model. But the final hurdles, and it was about actually getting those final cladding panels on. I think you can sort of see the side at that page. This was probably mid-January, and things were getting a little bit frenetic, knowing that students were about to arrive in 4 weeks' time. But the main final hurdle was the blower door test. So you need to average on for the entire, so they plant a blower on one of the ground floor doors, and then test a blow test, where they prime the blower up, and then they do a suck test, and the average of that has to be less than 0.6. And as you can see here, I think on the blow test, this reading, we were at 0.47. So this was a pretty heroic day on the project, as we had passed our blower door test and we had our airtight envelope. And what that means, this building is a 6,500 square metre floor plate. I can't remember the facade area off the top of my head, but the overall opening on the facade to be less than 0.6 was 0.3 square metres. So that's an opening overall over the entire extent of the facade. It's 30 centimetres by 1 metre. And we were around about sort of, I think, 25.25 square meters overall. So this is every gap, everywhere, every little opening. And I know where, and I actually know where half the little trickles openings were on the ground floor. So a really, really sort of high level of QA had been carried out by Multiplex to get to this point, and a sort of very successful sort of moment in the project. And you'll indulge me for a second maybe now as I just walk you through the finished project and give you a little bit more of a sort of architectural sort of completion sort of standpoint. So viewed from the campus hockey fields, the sandstone cliffs of the facade of Gillies Halls flickers through the eucalypts. Approaching to the north from the heart of the campus, the building language begins to reveal itself. The detailed unfolding of the metalwork screens that serve to strengthen the material and shade the windows play games of depth and contrast with shadows and light. To the southern edge of Gillies Hall, the ground floor spaces open to the banks of the new creek bed. The junction between the facade screen and the podium reveals the playful complexity in surface and detail. On arrival from the campus, the front door to the residence is framed by a burnt orange metal loop. On entry, the materials and palette begin to tell the story of the project. Timber panelling line the walls, an acoustic ceiling, and the CLT offcuts provide bench seats to sit and wait for friends. A stepping ply and cement sheet line walls guides the journey through to the ground floor social spaces in the north wing. The ply stain finishes to the pool and ping pong room line a gaming den, and glazed connections are maintained through the floor to the study spaces and landscaping beyond. In the southern ground floor wing, a large common room provides opportunity to gather, cook and watch movies with the whole Gillies community. Moving up the building, we arrive at one of the 5 floor kitchens where smaller cohorts of students gather. Glazed partitions maintaining the connection back to the main stair and the residential wings beyond. Looking outwards, the spaces enjoy views framed by the facades to the bush campus canopy beyond. Communal dining and study spaces combine to provide more social function at the heart of the plan. The exposed CLT to the stairs with the glazed connections back to the floor wings. The detailing of the stair elements exposes the robustness and warmth of what was essentially a structural material. The central spaces in each wing provide more areas to gather and make use of the CLT window offcuts of the facade panels. Inside the bedrooms, 4 subtle colour palettes complement the exposed structural CLT panels. And the detailing of the joinery is carefully considered and simply executed. The CLT is the hero, but it is student well-being that is ultimately the benefactor. And I'll say, stop the music, but does it work? Well, the thermal comfort model, which was modelled by AECOM, obviously early on, and on this diagram, what we have is the green band, which is the external temperature. The blue band was the modelled internal temperature, so how these aligned. The red, the acceptable band of between 20 and 30 degrees, but we're obviously trying to be Passivhaus compliant, needed to be under 25 for 90% of the time. And the actual performance of the building through its first 6 months of operation. So I think it's probably worth sort of talking. So the building became occupied in late February, early March. We had an extremely hot March as we went, and you can see the blue band sort of just peaked over the 25 for a few of those nights, but only just. The temperature in the building actually only varied between probably 1 to 2 degrees on any given day, and takes a long time to cool down or heat up. That was really due just to the early tuning of the building. But then really through those March through to June, the building was performing absolutely as modelled. In July, we all had a little bit of a panic attack, and there was a little bit of a dip in the modelling and in the temperatures, and we were hearing reports that students were cold. And then we found out that 80% of the students had gone home for their winter break. And as a result, we didn't have students in the building, and we didn't have laptops, and we didn't have all our modelled heating loads. So to get the building temperatures back up, they brought in 5 panelled heaters for the model for the holidays. So I think for us, by achieving Passivhaus certification, we hope that this project has proven the Passivhaus model in a warm climate at scale in Australia. And we're pretty proud of the fact that at least this building was not business as usual, but that it's a design which celebrates the authenticity of materials and structure. It provides high quality indoor environments for its residents, and ultimately is a rich celebration of student life and the experience of living on community on campus. And I have to say that we fundamentally applaud our client, Monash University, for allowing ourselves and the design team and builder to go on this journey, because I think they managed to achieve in Monash and get something that's something I think pretty remarkable for a benchmark in Australia. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon, for an amazing presentation. So you get some claps in the chat box. Also for Claire, who I forgot to ask everyone to give clap and smiley faces. You only get 2 options in, so I'm sorry about that. We've got a number of questions. I'm conscious of time, but I will ask a few and we'll see how we go. And because Claire started first, I'll start with you. So perhaps if all 3 of you turn your mic off, and you're welcome to ask more questions, obviously, as we go on. It's just a case of collating them and being conscious of time. So Claire, this is from Manu. Can you explain a bit more by what you mean by adaptation to place and how this manifests in Australia's diverse climate zone, e.g. Melbourne versus Sydney versus Brisbane? What are the specific differences?
So every building has to be designed for its site, and this could be Melbourne versus Sydney versus Brisbane, but it even plays out in Brighton versus Brunswick. Like it's very specific. You design for the sun. You design to let it have your building has to have solar access or restrict solar access depending on time of year and the conditions that are prevalent at the time. In terms of the performance of a building in Melbourne, say versus code or versus Sydney, in Sydney, we found that it's pretty easy to design a passive house building. The difficulty is in continuous insulation and air tightness and getting a ventilation system in. It's not about the thickness of a wall, for example. In Melbourne, as I mentioned, the insulation levels are about 50% more than code, or they were. And I should have noted that the residential code doesn't step up until 2022. And that's probably still in flux anyway. But every building's designed for its orientation, its site, and I should say, there's a bit of a rivalry or a bit of I'd say I guess quite a heated discussion at times of passive house versus passive solar. Passive house takes the good bits of passive solar. You want solar access, or you want to restrict solar access in summer, but you don't rely on things like thermal mass to keep you comfortable, because that's not reliable. You don't rely on diurnal temperature shifts, so it's not always cold overnight. Some nights it's over 30 degrees, so you can't rely on thermal mass or natural ventilation to keep you comfortable. And the other thing, it doesn't. So passive solar doesn't capture the impacts of measures like air tightness and ventilation, or ventilation systems with heat recovery specifically. So design for site, absolutely, very specifically. Yeah.
Stefan, you want to ask a question?
Yes, Claire, can I maybe just follow on with the question that I've been wanting to ask since 1986? When Ronald Reagan was president and the Talking Heads were still touring. Now, I just want to ask a question about thermal bridging. Obviously, that's a very important component about the performance of bringing a building to passive house standards. Can you elaborate a little bit on how measurable is the heat transfer through a thermal bridge? And can you measure its actual impact if thermal bridging is not achieved? Does that question make sense?
Yeah, so thermal bridging. So we get really specific about thermal bridging. We model every detail we use a program which is free, so anybody can play with it, called Therm. And we draw every detail. So we draw where the floor meets the wall, and we capture the steel or the wood or the insulation or the any layer in that, and we can measure how much heat based on that climate. So in Melbourne we measure the heat loss, you know, if it's 20 degrees inside, which is comfortable, and it's 0 outside, which is a cold morning, or, you know, your typical cold morning. And yeah, we capture that heat loss and we put it in our model. The other thing we measure that, you know, apart from heat loss, is what's the risk of condensation? What's the risk of moisture having an impact on that? So I think the answer to your question is in a very finite and minute detail. Yeah.
I'll ask a question of Simon, if I may. This comes from Tina Fox. I'll ask two questions, actually. The first one she asks is, what's the biggest issue that would prevent new buildings being passive house? And she's suggested that poor glazing is possibly the answer. So we'd be keen to know what your thoughts are. But the second question I thought you might like to answer as well is, would passive house work well in a school building? I presume primary or a secondary school is what she may be thinking of, and public spaces.
Yeah, no, those are two great questions. What's some of the most difficult aspects of passive house in general construction? I think in reality, it's achieving that airtight envelope. That's probably one of the main aspects to it, and ensuring that you've got a builder on board who is prepared to take on the risks of that, because it means that everything has to be considered holistically. The windows have to be sourced right. Ideally, they're passive house certified, so that you know as a designer that the window itself, the frame itself, meets the airtight requirements. The detailing has to be right. You've got to consider every possible opening in the building so that it meets it. That's probably the number one difficulty. And then I think as Claire was just sort of talking about thermal bridge-free construction, and I think, you know, it's such a long road for Australian designers to come on. I think that's the reality. We tend to design here and then solve the problems later, you know, and come up with the solutions afterwards. And you've really got to take a completely different approach. You've got to understand thermal bridges, and understand what they are, and then make sure that you're not creating problems when you design the building. You know, designing in a colonnade of concrete columns that create a, you know, wonderful overhang but actually are then tied into the main structure of the building and creating this really big thermal bridge. So we've got to change the mindset of how we design and look at the type of buildings that we design. You know, I was lucky enough to, Stefan alluded to, work in the UK in the early noughties, and so I had a grounding in probably well-designed buildings then, and we were designing, you know, the projects that I was working on there, public projects with sort of 300 mil, 250 mil of insulation at that time, no thermal bridges and HV systems, but, you know, very, very square, conservative buildings. And the reason for that was because the envelope is just fundamentally, you know, more expensive and more complicated. And so we just need to change, I think, the way that we design. It doesn't mean you can't do everything, but it just means that maybe we just need to refocus what the good things really are. Is passive house relevant to schools? Absolutely. Schools are a really terrific example of where passive house can and should be applied. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you get a really big benefit out of schools because they're a daytime use. So you're getting you're making really good use of the passive house model during the day. You're getting good solar access, but you're minimizing the sort of the energy efficiency. So you're providing, you know, as sort of Claire alluded to, passive house is about really creating great well-being internal spaces. And because passive house is centered around providing fresh air to these internal spaces, you don't get the buildup of CO2. So you don't get sleepy classrooms in the afternoon in schools. You know, it's just really basic stuff. You know, students are in these rooms for 3-4 hours at a time until they go on breaks, and you get a buildup of CO2. In most classrooms, students get sleepy, and so the afternoons are, you know, really troubling. And you've also got, in schools especially, you've got long-term asset holders. Anybody who, you know, principals are they're copying the operational expenditure of what gets built on their campus for the next 30 years. And so when you're offered a passive house model where that payback period may be anywhere between 6 and 8 years on that first investment, or maybe even less, you know, it really starts to make sense for clients because they get that operational, they get that sort of payback period instantly. So they're long-term asset holders. So, you know, schools it's pretty surprising that we haven't seen it really sort of taking off in that area at the moment, but hopefully we will soon.
Yeah, thanks Simon for the presentation. It was Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
I think it was good that you went through all the stages of the project, you know, starting obviously at the concept stage, and then finished at the post-construction evaluation. So, and that actually sort of generated sort of one question, obviously, which you would imagine would come up a few times. You know, what are the cost implications? You know, obviously, we don't need to know the exact budget, but you know, what is the difference in cost? Also, I'd also be interested, what's the cost to the practice? You know,
what's the cost of the practice? The cost of the practice. To be honest, I don't think there was a great cost to us as designers. We just had to think differently, and we got a chance to learn. So if you said cost, I don't even think there was a cost to us. It was, you know, a real learning experience for all of us, and we just had to make sure we were doing it right. I think there was we probably through design, I actually think we spent a lot more time sort of understanding mass timber construction almost than passive house in a strange sense. So there probably wasn't on cost. The cost to the project, and that's always a really big question. On Gillies Hall, we think the number was around about 10% to 11%, which I think is high. But I think that was very much in part due to the fast track nature of the project, and that we had to, because it was quite early on, I think, in large scale passive house construction in Australia, well, even 3 years ago, we didn't have access to you know, sort of, we didn't have passive house windows to be able to come out of China. We had to look to Europe. We had to almost go for the Rolls-Royce solutions for a lot of the aspects of the building, and we didn't have time to design out the scaffolding, for instance. So we paid a premium there. That was probably 3% of that 11%, you know, sort of thing. So I think, but we're seeing overseas, I know sort of in the UK, the numbers are being talked, there's around about sort of, I think schools in the UK are sort of being built anywhere between 4 and 6%. That seems to be a number that's being sort of tossed around. But we're also seeing, I think, because the buildings themselves are now simpler, you're getting almost down on parity. And I know there are architects that are working there. I think they can actually design passive house buildings cheaper than standard buildings because you're doing away with the complex stuff. And I think that's what's really fundamental. You know, you're making use of natural daylighting. Your heat recovery systems are actually pretty simple systems, and you're just designing things right. And the big thing is you're designing the building to work together. It's one system. So, you know, that's the big thing to get your head around. So yeah. And
for the occupants, does that generate a behavior change, or does it require a behavior change? Just looking at a student, if you leave your window too long, open for too long, you need to turn on your laptop to generate some heat. That's
a really good question. I think if you left your window open all day during winter and you came into your room, you probably would have a cold room. But because you've got your ventilation systems constantly supplying that tempered, well, essentially the heat recovery air, it would even out pretty soon. You know, a student accommodation building is an interesting building to have it in, because you've got these, you know, essentially the students probably, I'm going to decry students, but maybe they're not the most responsible people on the planet. But I think most of the students who live there kind of understand it. So they probably have got used to it, and they probably work out for yourself what is a good way for the building to operate. And I think the students that we've spoken to have, you know, given us a pretty massively positive response about living in it. But yeah, I mean, you live in the buildings you use, and you learn to use them. So you probably, it probably means you probably want to, they're probably buildings that the more you understand how they use them, the better they'll work for you, I think.
So we'll ask one more question of Claire, and then we'll wrap up, given that it's 8:30. And I'll bundle 3 questions up for you, Claire, because I'm sure you'll do it really easily. But the first question is, can you clarify that the NCC 2019 has improved 30 to 40% for commercial buildings? I suspect they mean in sustainability measures, but residential has a step up in the next revision. The next question is, do you have to be good at Excel to use PHPP? And the last question is, what's your vision for this is Chelina who's asked this, what's your vision for the future of better buildings here in Australia?
Well, the first one was NCC, right? So the 30 to 40% improvement for commercial is something that we have modelled, but it was also something, so we've modelled it to check it because it was something that was reported as part of the consultation process when the 2019 commercial or volume 1 code was rolled out. The second one, do you need to be good at Excel? Yes. I have seen the PHPP in various states of nonsense, I will say. If you don't want to be good at Excel, don't do it. If you want to know if your passive house building is a passive house building, get someone else to do it. It's something that took me a number of years to get good at. There's still some, I guess, German eccentricities about it, if I can sort of put it that simply. Australia works differently for some reason to, well, sorry, I shouldn't say that. Every jurisdiction works differently to the next, right? So we don't do things the same way they do things. So, and as a result, the PHPP is a bit of a foreign tool, but it works here. It just doesn't work the way we think it's going to work sometimes. So yeah, don't do it if you don't need to do it. And if you don't want to do it, get someone who can do it. The third question, what's a good building, or what's...
Sorry to put you in the spot, but it was to finish on the idea of what's your vision for the future for buildings here in Australia?
I want to meet those 4 pillars. I want buildings to be an investment that people get a return from, because that's where people still, people, I guess, unless you're living in a building, you don't assess it in the same way. But I'm going to say I want all buildings to be living futures or living building challenge buildings with passive house at their core. So they have to be healthy, they have to promote well-being, they have to be super energy efficient, and I still think that whole return on investment thing, like people, don't assess their buildings with any economic metrics. People buy houses that are basically tents that have no performance behind them. Assessing buildings holistically. Living Building Challenge does that amazingly well.
Okay. Yeah. I think that's a good place to end.
Okay. Okay. Obviously, thanks everyone. Thanks to everyone for attending, and thanks to all of our speakers. So obviously, you spend a lot of time preparing and presenting. So we can't, obviously, Architects Clare can't pay you, but we got some little presents. So Caroline, I know you like a good jurist, so here's a Barossa dress for you. Claire, a nice Pinot Noir from the Yarra Valley, and Simon, a Tarawara Estate Chardonnay.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thank you.
For the next 2 years, they age really well, so you don't have to worry about it.
Or I might take them from you.
So you keep them safe.
Brilliant.
Okay, thank you very much. That was fantastic. That was great.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Just stay tuned. More webinars are coming your way. Architects are active as ever, so stay tuned, and good things will come.
Thanks, everyone. That was fabulous. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Cool. Right.
Bye,
everybody. Bye.
Bye.
End? Yeah. 8:36.
8:36, nice.